Hi guys, I just wanted to go over our first free response together to talk about how it was scored and maybe give you a few pointers for your next one. This question was a little tricky, but the first thing I want to remind you guys to do is to first look at the diagram. So the diagram that they give you, we really need to make sure that we're using that diagram in our answers. So let's see here. So we have, first of all, the intestinal lumen. So we have that here. And then we have the epithelial layer, the outside, and then we have the blood. Okay, so this question has a lot going on. Anytime you see a free response question where you're seeing high and low levels of things, you want to see if you can tie cellular transport into that somewhere. So those fancy words like facilitated diffusion, simple diffusion, active transport, moving from high concentration to low, those are all words that we want to put into our responses. Okay, so the first one here on this first question, let's see. On this first question, we have, let me see if I get back to my pencil here. All right, so in our first question here, we have, let me see. All right, so we had the first question says glucose and sodium move from the lumen of the small intestine into the blood via transport proteins in the epithelial cell lining of the small intestine. Based on the figure, describes, that's our first one, describe the direct source of energy used to move glucose into the epithelial cell from the intestinal lumen. So they want you to say, how is this glucose moved into the epithelial cell? How is it brought in, period. So first of all, we see glucose moving from the outside, here, the intestinal lumen into the epithelial layer. And we see sodium also moving in. Sodium here is moving from high to low. Sodium moving from high to low is going to actually be powering the movement of this glucose. Okay, so hold on one second. Now, if you look at the scoring guidelines, it says energy from the sodium gradient. So the sodium moving from high to low is actually powering the movement of glucose. A lot of kids responded to this one by saying that it was going to be ATP that was powering the movement. Well, first of all, the sodium is going from high to low. So if the sodium is going from high to low, there's no ATP here that's needed. Okay, and glucose is moving from medium to high. So something is going to have to be powering that. We don't see the words pump. We don't see the words active transport. We don't see anything like that. The only thing that we see is that symporter. Okay, so when we see that symporter, it means that the sodium is helping move the glucose. It's symporting it, the type of co-transporter. So that ATP answer is out the window there. Now, a lot of answers also I noticed, and guys, I know that the scoring guidelines are online and I know that you can see them. They're there to help your writing. So if you simply put energy from the sodium gradient, from here on out, answers like that aren't going to be getting points. Okay, so if it's exactly word for word from what's here, no points, sorry. You have to do a description. So you have to put this into your own words of how that's happening. Now, if we look at this student's response and we take a look here at this student's response, we can see that we've got a sentence here. It says the Na glucose symporter, which she named the thing from the diagram, moves glucose into the epithelial cell from the intestinal lumen. So they also state the energy used to move the glucose comes from the sodium moving down its gradient, and the symporter, which allows energy for glucose to go against that gradient. Now, that is the kind of response we're looking for, cool cats. We need to see stuff like that in our responses. So that's part one. Okay, so responses that just restate that, no go anymore. So please don't do that, guys. Also, I don't know if you guys noticed, but at the beginning of the video from the free response of the next day, they walk you through how to answer the question. I want you guys practicing. So if you don't know the answer, watch the beginning of the next day's College Board review, and they're going to show you how to answer these. I want well-written responses that show that you know what you're doing. So I would like to see you referring to the diagrams, referring to moving high to low, referring to the things that you are seeing in the diagram, the symporter. Okay, no ATP here. Okay, second part of our question is asking for how that sodium concentration is maintained inside. So let's take a look. Let's take a look here. Okay, so let's look. Now it says explain how this system maximizes glucose absorption from the intestinal lumen into the epithelial cells and from the epithelial cells into the blood. All right, so how does this system maximize glucose absorption from the intestinal lumen? And it's even underlined on here. So you got two separate points here. Okay, so for glucose to keep coming in here, what has to happen? So how is this maximizing glucose absorption from here to here? Well, what happens if this sodium gradient equalizes? What happens if there's so much sodium rushing into the inside of the epithelial cell that we no longer have a gradient? That's where we need to reference this pump. So what's happening with this pump? Well, as the sodium's rushing in, this pump is pumping it out. Okay, if that pump wasn't working to pump it out, we would have no more sodium flowing into this epithelial cell, pulling the glucose along with it. So to maximize, that's where this pump is right here. So to maximize glucose movement into the epithelial cell, the sodium pump has to take sodium out. Okay, now how is glucose uptake into the blood maximized? That's our second question. So to get glucose to move into the blood, what has to happen? Well, there has to be a high concentration inside the epithelial cell and a low concentration out. So when we're moving to from high concentration to low, what's another word for that? Facilitated diffusion. It's going from high to low, and it's traveling through a transporter. So if it's going through a transporter, that means it's facilitated diffusion. Okay, all right, so that's part two. So that was a 2-point section there with that word and. Okay. So first, the sodium potassium pump maintains the sodium concentration. It's pumping that sodium out as it's coming in. And then secondly, the symporter. Okay, so that symporter is also allowing glucose to flow through facilitated diffusing, maximizing that glucose flow into the blood. So there was two separate parts here. So let's read the rest of the student's response. It says this system maximizes glucose absorption from the intestinal lumen into the epithelial cells, repeating the question, right? So that far has been repeated, by using the symporter, which minimizes energy consumption. Once the glucose enters the epithelial cell, it easily passes through due to passive transport. Awesome word choice there. The blood has a low amount of glucose compared to the epithelial layer, meaning the glucose that travels to the blood from the epithelial layer travels with the concentration gradient. Okay, so this is a really, really good answer. The only thing that we're missing from this response is the repumping in of sodium. Okay, So the pumping back in of the sodium by the sodium potassium pump to reestablish that was missing. Okay, but we have enough information here for a full response. Okay, so the glucose moving into there is another one. So I'm going to stop at this point, and I want to say good job so far on your free response question. You will have, and please take advantage of scoring guidelines. Like if you watch that beginning of that next video, you will find how to write the response for this. Okay, I hope everyone is doing well. And if you have any questions, please email me. Best way to contact me is actually on Remind. So if you have any questions, please let me know. All right, and I hope you guys all have a great evening. I'll talk to you soon.